If you're new to programming, you'd be forgiven for thinking that there is a right way to do things and your goal is to find the right way, but actually that's couldn't be further from the truth. So here's the thing, there are always better ways to do things and worse ways to do things, but ultimately it comes down to your goals. What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to do? And with code, there are many ways to solve the same problem. There are always many different ways. And there are ways that will help you move towards your goals better. So for example, if your primary goal is performance, there are ways to move towards that. If your primary goal is readability, there are ways to move towards that. If your primary goal is to work in a certain paradigm for a team's sake, because they're used to that paradigm, then there is a way to do that. There are all sorts of different ways to program, and there are different approaches and mindsets with it. And so let me give you some examples of how you can increment a number. And these are just 3 different ways. There are more ways that you could, but we're going to start with this. So we've got a value here. So value inside of algebra, if you think of X and where you have all those different algebraic formulas, this is basically that. I actually started learning programming before I took algebra in school, I was homeschooled, so before I started taking algebra classes during homeschooling, and it helped me understand algebra way better because I was like, oh, this is a variable. This makes a lot of sense. I see why I would care about this versus not having any reason to care at all. Anyway, so we've got value equals value plus 1. This is sort of the naive approach. This is what you don't do. If any programmer saw this, they would be instantly unimpressed if you're incrementing by 1. If you are adding 1 to any value, this is not the way to do it, but this is what most people would think of. Hey, I want to set this value, and so what the equals does actually in the case of code is that it sets the value on the left to the value on the right. It is actually a setter. It isn't saying, are these two things the same? So we are setting this value equal to itself plus 1. And so if value is 0, it will now be 1. If value is 2, it will now be 3. If value is 65, it will now be 66. And we issue order 66. And then we have example 2. And example 2 is a bit of a cleaner way of doing it. And this is actually saying, okay, so we are going to add on this number to itself. That's what plus equals does. Is it says, okay, take what I currently am and add this value to it. And so value, my current value, if it's 0, then it will be 1. If it's 2, then it will be 3, and so on and so forth. 65 will be 66, issue order 66, and it just will keep going along like that. So the way that this one works is actually the same. So plus plus is a shorthand that says, okay, so if you are 0, increment to 1. If you are 2, increment to 3, whatever. It's issue order 66. It's not funny anymore. Anyway, so we've got these 3 different ways of incrementing a number. Now, you'll pretty much always see this in the code base. There might be reasons to do the other one, so I'm not going to say you would never ever do that. But in general, you're going to see value plus plus, and this is how you're going to increment a number. So any programmer who sees these in the code base is probably going to be like, what were you doing and why? But there's different ways of solving the same problem in code. And so you might be thinking of it as some people present math, where it's like, how do I solve the problem? There's one right way. But in code, there are many different ways that you can solve the same problem. And it all comes down to what are your goals and what's the best way to accomplish them. Now let me show you processing a list. And you don't have to worry too much about the specifics here. So what this is, I guess I can say an algorithm because it sounds fancy, but really an algorithm is any type of code. And so incrementing a number by 1 is also an algorithm, it's an algorithm. It's an algorithm. It is an algorithm. And so honestly, I put 0 stock into the word algorithm. I think that it's just something that programmers say when they don't want to explain what they actually did. But anyway, here we are getting a list of ints. So an int is just a number that is a whole number. So 0, 1, 2, 3. It would not include 1.5 or 1.8 or 20.638407. And so here we have got this setup where we are going through a list and we're looking at every single item in the list and we're doing something with it. In this case, it's a really stupid example, but we have this value and we are setting the value to the numbers in the list. So if the list is 0, 8, 9, 10, 20, then we are going through and we're setting value to 0, then to 8, then to 9, then to 10, was it? And then to 20, I forget what I said. Anyway, so we got this for each and we're going through every single item in the list, every number in it, and we are over time setting the value to it. Now this is a very common way that you're going to see loops set up, and a loop is just you do the same thing over and over again using the same logic in general. So it's a bit of a simplification, but I think that works. And then here's another way that you can do the same thing though, and depending on your programming language, this might be more common. It just really depends. And what you would see here is that we are going to go through these items, and you can see there's this int I. And as long as I is less than the list count, we're going to increase it. And so what this means is that I will start at 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4, and it will increase itself by 1 every time. So we're going to look at the first item in the list, because lists start at 0 in programming. Oh yeah, there's another fun thing. And I mean, I like it. It makes sense to me now because I've been doing it for years. But you end up going through this list, and first you're going to look at the first item, which is at index 0, then the second item, which is at index 1, third item, index 2, and so on and so forth. And so this is another way that you can go through a list of things. And let's look at example 3 now. So example 3, you have another way of doing it, which is actually to go through a list in reverse. There are reasons to do this. For example, perhaps you actually want to return the latest item in a list, and this is a way to do that. Perhaps you want to make some changes that would remove items from the list. If you go through the list from start to end, then you're going to run into an issue where, hey, you removed an item from the list at point 0, and now the second item in the list is now at point 0, and so you're going to run into problems with looping over that. And so running a loop in reverse is one way to resolve this. And so in this case, we are starting at the list count minus 1, because the list count is, if you have 5 items, then it will be 5. But as I mentioned, arrays or lists start at index 0, and programming pretty much everything starts at index 0 unless you're using MATLAB, which why would you be? And so then we can end up going through this list, and we go back in time to 0, and so we're looking at the last item, we're going back, and then we're running our processing. Here's another way that we could, in theory, do this, and no programmer is going to be happy with you if you do it this way, but I'm trying to remember, I think that I've had some use cases where this kind of setup made sense, but there's definitely many ways that it can not make sense and be really gross. So anyway, very canned example. We've got this int, this number, so we're setting it to 0, and we're saying, hey, while this is less than the count of the list, that go through and we're going to do our whole setting value to I while, and we are setting I while, we are incrementing it every single time that we run this. So it's a pretty goofy example, but that's another way to do it. Another is for each, and here we are passing in the value of the list item, and we're setting value to x. So those are 5 different ways to go through a list of numbers. Now, which one do you use? Which is the correct one? Now, there's generally going to be many wrong ways to write code, but the question of which is the right way to write them, that can be a bit stickier, and people can have more questions on that. So what I would say, though, is just as a very basic level, it comes down to your goals. This one probably don't use unless it aligns with your goals. So whenever you are looking at code or stuff like that, or I guess whenever you're looking at code, this is really targeted towards people who aren't as familiar with programming, obviously. There are always many different ways to solve the same problem. And so the question becomes not, how do I solve the problem, but how do I solve the problem based on my goals? You know, there are many different ways that you could. I'm trying to think of an example that I know about other than programming, because programming is what I know more than anything else. That sounds like I know more about programming than I do. I feel like that makes it sound like I'm like a master programmer, and I wouldn't say that. But let's say that you, wow, I totally lost track of my example. Anyway, the thing is that if you are very familiar with something, you know that there's many different ways that you can solve the same problem. And so the question becomes, what is the best way to solve the problem for my use case? So here's 3 different ways to increment a number, 5 different ways you could process a list, and there's more than that. Like, these are not the only ways to do this. And so programming ends up being a very interesting exercise, not just in, hey, how do I logically solve this problem, but critical thinking for what is the best way to solve this problem for my use case and for my scenario, for my context. It could be that you're programming to try to just write code as fast as possible, and so you have one approach for that. You could be writing code to run as fast as possible, so your code is fast rather than you being fast, and so that could be another approach. You could say, hey, I want to fit in this paradigm. There's all sorts of different approaches and programming ideologies, and so yeah, there are many different ways to solve the same problem. Let me know if you have any questions or if this was interesting for you. I know that for me, this is sort of, I'm very used to thinking about these sorts of things, but I take for granted what I know. And so let me know if you have any questions, or if you want to drop anything in the comments, anything else that you'd like me to cover or get into, let me know. Hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Take care.